The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's REMI webinar, Oil Price Increases, Economic and Fiscal Impacts. This webinar is being presented by Dr. Peter Evangelakis from REMI. Dr. Evangelakis is the Senior Vice President of Economics and Consulting at REMI, based in our Washington, D.C. office. After joining the company in September 2017, he has served as Principal Investigator on a wide variety of consulting projects and published papers, provided technical and advisory support to clients, contributed to economic modeling software development, and made many presentations to professional and government audiences. Peter holds a PhD and master's degrees in economics from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree in economics and mathematics from Swarthmore College. At REMI, our mission is to inform public policy. For over 40 years now, we have provided software that allows government and non-government decision makers to test the economic effects of their policies before they're implemented. We work in the fields of economic development, tax, transportation, energy, environment, much more. If you have any questions about REMI specifically, I encourage you to reach out to us at info@remi.com, and we would gladly assist you. Some more logistical things here. If at any point during this presentation you have a question, we encourage you to enter it into the question box. Time permitting, I will moderate these questions to Peter, and if we aren't able to get to your question, we'll be sure to reach out to you personally. We will also be sending a copy of the slides and a recording to your email, so keep your eyes out for that after the presentation. And finally, there's a new feature of GoToWebinar that allows you to zoom in to charts and graphs by clicking in and dragging it around and using your scrolling wheel. There's also plus and minus buttons. I encourage you to use that to make anything that's small a little easier to read. And that's enough for me for now. Thank you so much again for joining, and I will pass it off to Peter.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone for attending. Today we wanted to talk about obviously something that's on everybody's minds, certainly as the war with Iran kind of reignites, and kind of the issues with the Strait of Hormuz. What are the impact of the oil price increases that we've seen? I wanted to look at how to do kind of economic and fiscal impact modeling. So looking at kind of the national, at the regional level, also at the state level, and at the state level being able to hone in not just on the economic, but also on the fiscal impact. We'll basically, we'll kind of talk a little bit more about REMI. We'll talk about, oil prices, kind of how that works, and then look at how to model, what kind of an oil shock through our economic modeling software, and then I'll kind of set up a live demo, and then, offer some concluding remarks, and happy to take any questions. So for those of you who may not be familiar, REMI has been around since really the 70s as a state policy model in Massachusetts, coming out of UMass Amherst. We were incorporated in 1980 as a company, and we have clients all over the U.S. We've done work across a wide variety of policy areas. We have many federal and especially state and local agencies that have been longtime clients, or with economic development organizations, universities, think tanks. It really runs the gamut. Our core mission is being able to understand, what are the economic impacts of either public policy or kind of key economic shocks, like we're seeing with maybe a combination of the two, with the oil price increases that we've seen, especially during the most recent war, and being able to understand, at different levels of geography, as well as impacts over time, how kind of impacts evolve, as policies and situations evolve. Turning to kind of the matter at hand, oil prices, they really matter for a variety of reasons. They affect, so many different parts of the economy. Obviously the most, newsworthy, kind of the most obvious way that, consumers, you and I see it is, with gas prices rising. So, that affects, that household transportation cost. really it affects so much more. As many businesses, especially the trucking, kind of the trucking and other transportation sectors certainly use a lot of oil, but also using power that may be generated using, kind of oil and gas. And that really gets into a lot of the supply chains. If everything has to be transported, so that gets into things like goods, food, which, and a separate matter that we won't really talk about today. Another choke point has been fertilizer in the Strait of Hormuz, which is, more directly affecting, which is, I guess, another factor affecting kind of the price of food, but certainly the cost of transporting it is also exacerbated by increased oil prices. And certainly, maybe in the long term, consumers, if oil prices stay high, consumers can, rejigger, how much they're commuting or how much they go out, how much they use their car, maybe in the long run buy more fuel efficient cars. But in the short term, it's really hard to make those kind of big adjustments. And so it can be a real hit to consumer kind of purchasing power, the more money out of their pocket to pay for gas. And in a more hidden way, goods that had to be transported, where that higher cost is passed on through inflation. And all of those kind of various factors, we see reflected in, slowdowns in economic activity. So certainly employment, if, business, if people are spending less, able to spend less, that means businesses are earning less. So that hits employment, economic growth. And then, as I alluded to, we wanted to talk about at the state level, not just the economic impacts, but also the fiscal impacts. As economic activity slows, the tax base shrinks. And so that's gonna hit tax revenues, with one notable exception that I'll leave as a teaser for now, but that I'll come back to in terms of state revenues. And maybe this will be another teaser. Certainly, there are, there's a class of winners here for, oil prices going up. Obviously, the oil producers, and there are certainly certain parts of the country where that activity is more common, Texas, Wyoming, et cetera, where at least there will be, certain stakeholders that do see a benefit from higher oil prices. And so, again, this all starts, obviously, it's a global oil market. So, there's certainly a lot of discussion in the U.S. that, we're much more energy independent than we used to be, ever since the fracking revolution. We're, kind of the largest oil producer in the world now, I believe. And so, we're not as reliant, on, foreign oil, on OPEC, things like that we used to be. And certainly that's helpful in a time when there's a global oil shock. But, even though that means that maybe we don't see shortages, or at least shortages as soon as other parts of the world where we have seen shortages and rationing of energy. We still, at the very least, see, higher oil prices. That translates into, again, higher gas prices, that we can see on the big signs outside of gas stations, but also, again, that feeds into inflation. Inflation numbers, most recent numbers, cooled a little bit from the previous month, but they're still well above the target that, the Fed is interested in, at 2%. We're well over 3% year-on-year inflation. And this is certainly one of the contributing factors to that. And, that affects, both, the consumer side as well as the business side. So, we'll talk about when we do kind of the modeling of what, how an oil price shock, impacts the economy, obviously on the consumer side. And we're going to focus, our analysis, a little bit more narrowly on, essentially gas, but, certainly with the caveat that, there are a lot of other goods and services to some degree as well affected by, the higher cost of transporting goods, goods around the world. So consumers are hit, they face higher prices. Again, that's the kind of the consumer purchasing power being hit. But also, businesses see their fuel costs rise. And certainly, again, in the transportation sector, that's most, acute. But there are other businesses as well that, that are either directly or indirectly using, oil and gas that see higher prices that kind of feed into, kind of higher fuel costs. And again, that's, those shocks at kind of the micro level, each household seeing higher gas prices, each business seeing higher cost of fuel, gas or electricity that may be generated by oil and gas. That's gonna translate up, kind of economy wide, whether it's at the state level, at the kind of national, regional level, kind of across the nation as a whole. They're going to be, macroeconomic impacts that kind of ripple out from that. Again, if people aren't able to spend as much on other things because they have to spend more on fuel, then those other businesses that were receiving that the consumer dollars now see less revenue and have to tighten their belts. So that translates into hits on employment and GDP. And again, on the plus side, obviously oil producers, that particular industry, do see a benefit. I think generally outweighed by the kind of the wider spread impacts on price, but there are that particular class of winners, so to speak. And again, we'll talk about both the economic and the fiscal. So just to get into what we did in terms of kind of modeling this, we chose kind of a nice round number. The oil prices have gone up and down. It's a famously volatile price, and so we didn't want to try to hook it to any particular price, kind of price change. This is an annual model, so I think in a backward-looking analysis, maybe we want to look at from 2025 to 2026, what was the percent increase, and maybe use that. For now, we're in the middle of it. Oil prices going up and down, especially as political negotiations ebb and flow. So we just picked a nice round number of a 10% oil price increase, and we ran with that. And so again, as I mentioned before, we have kind of several different parts of the economy that we wanted to look at. So again, the first was on the consumer side, again hitting the motor vehicle fuels kind of consumption categories. So in our model, we have kind of a lot of kind of industry level. We have the kind of industry level forecast and the ability to do shocks. So in the model that you'll be seeing, we have it at the kind of, there's 70 industries, roughly at the 3-digit kind of NAICS code level, which for those of you who may not be familiar, it's kind of an intermediate level of detail of industry. We also offer a 160 sector version that has kind of 4-digit NAICS code level, much more detail on manufacturing, energy, things like that. And then in terms of, we also have a GDP forecast, and we break that out by the different GDP components. If you did Econ 101, that's, consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So for each of those kind of 4 pieces, we have kind of a breakout. So for personal consumption expenditures, which is what we're focusing on for this first step here on the left of the screen, one of the categories, there are 75 categories that we've broken it out into. So we looked at the motor vehicle fuels, category. And we said, okay, there's going to be an increase in the consumer price for that category as a result of higher gas prices. And again, that's not kind of a full accounting of the price increases that consumers are seeing, but it's kind of for demonstration purposes. That's kind of the most obvious. So we wanted to keep it high level in that way. So that's the hit to consumers, is the higher gas prices. And then for businesses, they're going to see higher fuel costs, and in particular, higher, we have the kind of petroleum in the model that's kind of called residual, the petroleum kind of fuel costs, for industries. So, in our model, as as you might expect, the costs for businesses, they include labor costs, the cost of capital, equipment, things like that, the cost of intermediate inputs, and the cost of fuel. And so, fuel is a component of, of overall cost. So it's not it's not impacting the other costs, at least not directly, but they do see an increase in their fuel costs. Again, primarily through that kind of petroleum, to the extent that they use petroleum directly. And again, that's probably somewhat of an undercount in terms of, all of the various ways where their fuel might be more expensive, not to mention their intermediate inputs. If they're shipping their, if they're a manufacturer, their parts coming from somewhere else, now they have to pay more because the transportation costs are higher. So again, we're not capturing all of the different ways that the costs are higher. This is, again, kind of the most obvious way, but I think it's, again, illustrative of what the impacts are. And then the final piece is, we did want to acknowledge that, there is this class of winners, so to speak, where, if you're an oil producer, oil prices are higher, it's going to induce you to produce more, and kind of that'll be kind of a revenue boost. And so here we use this kind of demand variable to, because we're looking at kind of a nationwide shock, but we want to make sure that, we're capturing the oil production where it's actually happening. And in our model, what we do is we have these kind of two different ways of looking at production. We have kind of an output, which is, okay, here's the production that's happening in a particular region. So if there's output, if there's oil production, for example, in Texas, and we put it there, that's where the production happens. But if we say, oh, we're in, Florida, and, we're obviously demanding a lot of gas, we have all of the drivers and all of the other, uses of oil and kind of oil products, that's going to create a lot of demand. And that demand, it could be in principle satisfied by production within the state, but knowing Florida in particular, that's not really one of the industries that's operating in Florida, or at least not very much. And so the demand allows us to capture kind of cross-regional trade flows. And we have estimated trade flows based on where the production happens, where the demand is, what kind of the transportation costs are. And so basically we're able to capture a more realistic picture of where the oil production is actually happening. Okay, there's this hit to demand, or there's this increase in demand from Connecticut and Nevada and North Carolina, so on and so forth. But a lot of that production happens, kind of the production of the oil, the kind of the pulling it out of the ground, et cetera, happens Texas, Wyoming, Alaska, et cetera. And so we're kind of localizing it in that way. So we're kind of capturing geographically where some of the winners might be. This is, again, kind of a summary for you. With the consumer side, there are consumer prices of gas. Business side, there are kind of residual or petroleum fuel costs. And then kind of the demand side, kind of the winners here, where there's, an increase in revenue for the oil producers, essentially. And then, as I alluded to earlier, we also want to look at the fiscal impact. So I'll just note, we looked at kind of, again, 2 different states. I kind of previewed them already in the discussion. We looked at kind of Florida and Texas and the economic or the fiscal impact, kind of the revenue impact, for the state in those 2 different, in those 2 different states. And so just to kind of hone in on that a bit, again, obviously, the U.S. as a whole is a major energy producer, but there's a lot of regional variation. So obviously, Texas, major oil and gas producer, a lot of refining of petrochemical. Florida is more, has a fairly diverse economy, but it is, it's certainly not weighted towards oil and gas production or refining. It's much more, at least partially tourism and hospitality. That's kind of the thing you think of, at first, and that's obviously a huge industry in Florida. There's a lot of ag as well, but there's not really that kind of oil production and refining, and so any benefits of higher oil prices are really going to accrue, you would expect, more in Texas than in Florida. And certainly, at the kind of the revenues level, that kind of translates into, what are called severance taxes. And so severance taxes is, okay, natural resources like oil or coal, things like that, that are taxed directly on the kind of what's pulled out of the ground. And so we'll see when I open up the model and kind of run the analysis, and we'll see, pretty, substantial kind of severance tax kind of positive impacts for Texas, whereas they're pretty negligible for Florida. And then just, in terms of looking at some of the economic impacts, obviously we did this at the state level, kind of alluding to different states. We did this with a 51 region, 50 states plus DC kind of tax PI model. So that allows us to capture the economic impact state by state, the revenue impact state by state. Here we're honing in on a couple of states for the fiscal, but we're able to look at the, kind of the regional kind of impact as well. And so these are broken out by the kind of census divisions. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick stop on my screen share and just transfer over to the model to do a live demo. And then after that, offer some concluding remarks, and then happy to take questions. Bear with me 1 second. Let's go. Let's go to our model here. So just getting confirmation that folks can see the screen.
Yes. Yep. Looks good.
Great. Thank you. So again, this is our tax PI model. So it builds on our kind of foundational model, our kind of, dynamic regional economic impact model, and it allows us to look at the fiscal impacts, the revenue and expenditure impacts. Here we'll focus on the revenue side, generally at the state, but sometimes at the local level as well. So it kind of builds, builds in, and the basic idea, for the revenue side is, we have very detailed economic forecasts. So I'll just briefly show our regional control. And so I'll do this. So here again, in this model, we have all of the states. So I'll just park it on the Florida forecast, but you're able to see, by region, everything by region. Essentially, we basically take these detailed forecasts. So, we have, kind of top line numbers here in this economic summary, like the employment forecast, the GDP forecast for the state, the forecast of personal income. We're also able to look at, for example, employment by industry. And for example, against Alabama, so we can switch it to Florida or Texas or whatever it is. This is the same top level number, and then we're able to look, industry by industry. You're also able to look at, for example, the income profile. So, again, I'll go to Florida, and we can see kind of total personal income down here, and then all of the components. And so we have very detailed forecasts. And what the tax PI model allows us to do is to essentially say, okay, we can take budget data. So usually we look at the latest fiscal year of available revenue, sometimes expenditure data, and we say, okay, what are the drivers of the different kind of revenue categories? So, for example, in a state that has a personal income tax, personal income, would be, a natural driver of that revenue category. For example, personal consumption expenditures, consumer spending would be a natural, driver for sales tax. And you can get into some more of the weeds, but that's kind of the high level of it, is that, we're able to layer, the kind of the revenue and expenditure data, that comes, usually from the states, kind of the official kind of, budget numbers, layer them on top of our detailed forecast, and then generate kind of a fiscal forecast based on that. And so then we're able to look at, not just the economic impacts, but now those economic impacts, have an effect on the tax base, and that change in tax base affect the, state revenues and, state budget. So that's the basic idea. So what I want to do is show you what we did in terms of the simulation. So let's do, consumer price. So I'm not going to show kind of all of the lines here. There's a lot of detail here. They're basically kind of state by state. This is the consumer price variable for, again, motor vehicle fuel, lubricants, and fluids. This is where gas, paying for gas. That gas falls in this category. And again, we looked at roughly kind of a nice round number, kind of roughly kind of a 10% increase. We put it in kind of dollar terms, but it's basically an increase in gas prices that we have here, and that's hitting consumers. For businesses, we had the fuel cost. Again, this residual. This means petroleum in the model. So it's kind of petroleum fuel cost. Again, region by region, kind of state by state, and then this is kind of across all different industries. To the extent that different industries use petroleum more or less, they're going to be more or less affected. And then again, and I should note, we're looking at these, just over kind of a short-term period, just kind of 2026 to 2028. That applies to kind of the whole analysis. And so those are kind of the costs. Again, just the costs that we're modeling, not, certainly not an exhaustive list of all of the costs, that would come from an increase in oil price, but some of the most kind of obvious and demonstrative. And then for the winners, so to speak, here we have this kind of demand for this petroleum and coal products manufacturing. That's kind of the production side. Obviously, petroleum and coal products manufacturing, kind of the refiners, essentially. That's kind of the industry that has all of the oil refiners. Obviously, they generate a lot of demand for the oil and gas extraction. That's where they get the oil and gas that they're refining. Um, and so again, the demand here means that we're, allowing, even though there's, demand occurring, in all of the states, all of the states use oil and gas, but it's produced in, in particular states much more than in others. And so we're allowing the model to reflect that. And so I've already run it. So we'll go to the economic results. So again, we can look region by region, in this case, kind of state by state. I'm just going to, for the moment, look kind of at the national level first. So, this is obviously, we're putting in a big shock. So this is, pretty large impact. We can kind of, think about scaling this down for, more, kind of more modest sized impacts. What we're seeing here kind of nationwide, about a, kind of, million jobs or so, impacted. We're seeing, big hits to personal income, in the range of about 100 billion, which is, pretty non-trivial, even kind of per household. We're seeing hits to GDP in kind of the $100 billion range. So, pretty significant impacts kind of at the aggregate level. We can also look, let's take a look here at, I'm just going to kind of pivot this a little bit so we can see the employment impacts by region. I will do the categories up here, total employment. And so we do see, kind of across the board, across the different regions, we do see, kind of negative kind of impacts, throughout. But if we go, just referring back, West, South, Central is, so here, this is, the region with Texas, for example. We see, even though Texas is, obviously a major part of that region and a very large state, we see, fairly modest, job impacts, negative impacts there, buoyed, kind of the price impacts are, buoyed by the benefits to the oil, oil production. So we can see, some of that, kind of some of the winners and losers happening here, whereas, see, in the South Atlantic, which is where I believe Florida would be, just referring back here, the South Atlantic, much larger impact, even though, none of the states are as large as Texas, and then, if we look at, let's go back to the, I'll kind of reset this, or rather we can go to, let's just go to the PCE price index. So this is the impact on prices. Not surprisingly, we're seeing an increase in prices, and we'll just do a percent change. So we see kind of across all regions, we're seeing, between a 4 and 5, I guess 0.4 and 0.5% increase in the overall price level, just coming from oil and gas. So that's pretty significant, and that's the major driver. Businesses becoming less competitive because they have higher costs, and then the higher prices, both the higher gas prices that consumers see directly, but also businesses seeing higher fuel costs themselves are having to then, potentially raise their prices. so that it kind of escapes contained, it kind of goes across all industries. Again, this is felt most acutely in kind of the transportation sectors where, obviously they're having to, fill their trucks and airplanes and trains and stuff with fuel. But it kind of goes across all different industries. And so you're seeing kind of the price increases, again, hitting consumers and then businesses being less competitive. And so if we want to look now just at the kind of the fiscal impacts, so we're going to want to hone in now kind of to the state level. Just reopen this 1 second. Here, and I'll add in the total for. So here we're looking at, we did a fairly high level kind of fiscal analysis. So we pulled data, tax revenue data from the census government tax tables, and we kind of honed it down to some key categories. We omitted the personal income tax here just because both of the states that we have to look at don't have personal income tax. But here we had, the sales tax, corporate income tax, what I highlighted before, the severance tax, which looks at basically taxing what comes out of the ground. So in this case, the oil severance tax, and then kind of grouping of kind of all other taxes. So not surprisingly, we see with the kind of big economic downturn, we do see a pretty sizable impact on the budget. This looks like on the order of just on between the $750 million and $1 billion or so dollars hit to the budget, so pretty significant. If we look at Texas, we also see a hit, but it's smaller. It's actually smaller than the hit to Florida's budget, even though Texas has a larger budget. And the severance tax impact, here, this is, on the order of, $250 million. So, so here we see, the increase in oil production, really, at least not kind of, it's not putting Texas into the black, in terms of the fiscal impact, but it is, really cushioning the impact of the hit to sales tax, for example, where people are spending a lot less, but the oil producers are producing a lot more with the higher oil prices, and that's generating a lot of severance tax revenue. So again, kind of the oil prices rising have, maybe I'll just go back to the slides here. We'll just do some concluding remarks. Oil prices have a lot of kind of varied impacts across a lot of different stakeholders. Impacts being households, businesses, and obviously certain businesses in different ways. The oil producers benefit other businesses that see their fuel costs rise. Obviously not so much. And then because different industries are concentrated in different parts of the country, certain regions are impacted in different ways, and there's certainly their budgets in terms of their state budgets are affected differently. As we saw with kind of contrasting Texas revenue impacts with Florida's impacts. At least to the scale where in Texas the growth in severance tax revenue at least cushioned the blow to some degree. So with that, happy to conclude and take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Peter, for the awesome presentation. Thank you to everyone who has who joined. We've received a couple questions so far. but we're shortly going to be getting into the Q&A portion of the presentation, so feel free to add more if you have any. I also want to remind everyone that about an hour after this webinar concludes, we'll be sending a copy of the slides and recording to you through email. So once you've had a chance to review everything a little more closely, I encourage you to reach out to us at the email address on the screen, and I'll get you in touch with Peter to assist with that. So the first question we received is, does the model account for Federal Reserve monetary policy in response to inflation from increased fuel prices?
That's a great question. So the short answer is it can. So in this analysis, we kept it high level, and we didn't incorporate that, but that is basically a feature in terms of what we call a closure in the model, where there is a version of the model, and maybe I can go to the model itself, and let's see if I can do this on the fly here. So yeah, so the closure options. So here the Keynesian, this is kind of the default, and it has no restrictions. But then there is this anticipatory Fed response, where we do see essentially changes in interest rates affected, kind of through, kind of filtered through kind of capital costs, essentially, like the cost of capital is rising. Is kind of the way that we're capturing maybe higher interest rates. Now it's a bit tricky in it's a bit trickier in a supply chain shock, like kind of supply shock, like an oil supply shock, where you have both a contraction and an increase in inflation. Obviously, that puts the Fed in a bit more of between a rock and a hard place. But in terms of is the model capable? Yes, we have that, what we call that closure option. So here, the model, let's say, with a demand shock that, is like a positive demand shock. Let's just say, we have some big, big influx of money, and people are spending a lot more, and that's pushing up inflation. Here, the model would say, okay, let's say that the Fed, raises interest rates, that raises capital costs, and it's kind of doing an iteration where it's saying, okay, let's keep employment about steady, because really, like, we don't actually have much room to grow. In the case of, if we start to get inflation, we're kind of at the natural rate of unemployment. We don't want, employment kind of rising, too much. So basically, the model is saying, okay, to what extent do we need to raise the cost of capital through interest rates to kind of keep the employment impact steady? So anyway, that's a bit in the weeds, but the short answer is yes, we can account for that. We didn't in this demonstration, just to keep things a little bit more simple and kind of talk through the different dynamics, but it is possible.
Awesome, great. Thank you, Peter. The next question we received is, how does the model distinguish between a temporary supply disruption and a prolonged oil shortage?
Certainly. So, one thing that I talked about a little bit, but I think I want to highlight a bit more is, the model is in a dynamic model. You can look at the kind of impact over time. So our forecast goes out to 2060, and so you can run simulations out to 2060, year by year. So here we did kind of a shorter term, couple year impact analysis. But certainly you can run it for much longer. So I think just in terms of kind of the mechanics of the timing in the model, that you're able to run kind of a shorter term or a longer term analysis based on how far out you put the shock into the model. But in terms of there's also the question of probably a short term versus a long term shock has maybe different implications. And there are different ways of capturing. Again, I kind of alluded at the kind of at the beginning of the talk that other countries were seeing kind of much more rationing than we're seeing in the U.S., where we're seeing higher prices, but not really rationing of like energy. And So if you were to start seeing rationing, then the shock you might change it from being kind of the fuel costs being higher to kind of output or production just dropping because we're just we can't produce as much because we have an absolute shortage. So there would be different kind of levers that you can pull, different what we call policy variables in the model, depending on what's happening on the ground, whether it's kind of a change in prices, which is what we modeled here, versus like a shortage where you're just mechanically can't produce as much.
Great. Thank you for the response, Peter. It's actually all the questions we've received so far. So I'm going to go ahead and begin our introduction. But as I mentioned earlier, if there's anything that comes up after that you have any questions regarding for this presentation, we encourage you to reach out to the email address that was on the final screen of the PowerPoint, which is info@remi.com, and we'll gladly connect you to the right people here at REMI. Thank you once more to Peter for an awesome presentation, and thank you to those who joined us today. We have a few webinars coming up in the future that you can check out on our website if you're interested in more applications of REMI's models. And again, we appreciate your attendance and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you, everybody.